Welcome to the Lit Professor, talking today about the Indomitable Mindset and the Battle of Borodino. Battle of Borodino is one of the epic battles of all of history. You have Napoleon pursuing the Russians into the jaws of winter, the teeth of winter. Napoleon is falling into what could be considered a trap, led by what could be considered an ingenious plan. I'm going to argue that there were some flaws with this plan today at some point, but to a certain extent it was a somewhat ingenious plan of the Russians to lure Napoleon into the jaws of the Russian winter, because after all, Napoleon was one of the greatest military minds in history, and the Russians perhaps wisely realized that they could not outfight this guy. And so I'm talking today about the Battle of Borodino, battle scene written by Tolstoy in his epic novel War and Peace. And so he's writing a scene about this. He's talking about Prince Andrew's regiment between 1 and 2 o'clock, and how they're on this oat field and they're just lying there. Now the setup is that the Russians believe they have this incredible, invincible position, and then Napoleon's going to kind of attack. They're assuming that Napoleon he's been pursuing so long, he's going to be desperate to take action and have a decisive battle, and so they're going to lure him into a sort of trap, and because they've got the superior ground, and that's what happens. That's what happens. Napoleon reacts, and he attacks multiple times, and it's a disastrous battle for both sides. It's the casualties are. Men are dropping by tens of thousands all over the place. Tolstoy writes, without moving from the spot or firing a single shot, the regiment here lost a third of its men. So Prince Andrew is lying around here, and he's losing a third of his men. That doesn't sound like a very good battle plan, but there is that certain to a certain extent, they felt that it worked. Their plan worked. It didn't work for a third of their men. That's a lot of men. You're talking, if you lose 100,000 men, what kind of battle plan is that? You go, we won. Yeah, you won, but you lost 100,000 men. And if that's the best you can do, then maybe that is a win. But I think they could have done better in this case. I mean, they are going up against Napoleon, who is a genius, but I'm going to argue that they missed an opportunity here. So I've analyzed hundreds of battles, and I've identified a number of patterns between success and failure in battles. And you have to ask yourself, for example, if you've got sort of like a mousetrap situation where you've got this invincible territory, the equivalent of, let's say, the high ground, and a place where you can't be dislodged from, and then you got Napoleon coming right down the middle into this, and you feel that you can hold the ground here. You could hold the ground, and it's going to be brutal for Napoleon to try to attack because he's got the worst position. So Tolstoy writes, all alike were morose. Talk was rarely heard in the ranks. All of the men were taciturn and morose. Well, of course they were taciturn and morose. Tolstoy just wrote here, a third of the men were lost. That's, one. That means two. If you're standing there, the guy on your left you saw his arms and legs fly off in different directions. The guy on your right had his head blown off. Of course you're going to be taciturn and morose if you're just sitting there shaking in your spot and with nothing to do. What's there to be excited about? So, especially if you can't even attack, you just got to hold your position. So, they're taciturn and morose, as Tolstoy writes, all alike. Altogether, every time a thud would be heard, it would go boom, thud, and then stretchers. So this is the kind of sensory stimulation you get. It's very depressing. So Tolstoy writes, these morally exhausted men found relief in every common day occurrences. So they see a dog prancing across the distance, and they're all going, oh, look at the dog. Look, if you want to watch dogs, YouTube videos has lots of cute dogs, but when you're in the middle of a battle and 2 out of 3 men are being blown to pieces, that's not really the ideal time for dog watching. So uh, Tolstoy writes, considering it he's writing about Prince Andrew in this situation, considering it his duty to raise the courage of his men and set an example, he walked among the ranks, but he soon came convinced that this was unnecessary. Of course, his men they're morose and depressed, and he decides, no, we don't need to rouse. There's no need to rouse their morale here, get their spirits up. Of course not. And he writes, and there was nothing he could teach them. That may well be the case. In this situation, based on what's going on, it doesn't seem like there's anything he can teach them. But that's a real cause for concern. If Napoleon was walking around, he would not be thinking, oh, there's nothing I could teach these guys. He could teach them encyclopedias of wisdom about how to win and how to react to circumstances. But not Prince Andrew here. There was nothing he could teach them. So that's a big cause for concern here. Now, Tolstoy writes, this is when things go downhill, because Tolstoy writes about Prince Andrew. He walked among the meadow, dragging his feet, rustling the grass, and gazing at the dust covering his boots. He stripped the flowers. He rubbed them in his palms. He smelled their pungent, sweetly bitter scent. Look, if 2 out of 3 of your men are being blown to bits, is this really the time to smell the roses and stripping flowers? Do you think Napoleon would be doing that? I don't think so. Napoleon would be making adjustments to his plan and turning his defeat into victory. But that's not what happens here. Now, finally he shouts, "Adjutant, order them not to crowd together." So he says, don't crowd together. Now, that's not bad. That's actually a good idea. We don't want to get everybody blown up by the same shell, so we spread them out. And since we're just sitting there, it'll take longer to blow them up. So that's pretty good, but it's a little bit of victim wisdom because you're not taking action to turn the situation around, so it's really just prolonging the inevitable. You're hearing, look out, and a shell drops, and then the horse rears up, and the sailors or the soldiers all see the fear in the horse's eye. Well, and then it says the terror infected them. Well, look, this guy to your left is, missing arms and legs. You've got this guy to your right, his guts are all over your chest and your face. Probably you've already got some terror in that these guys are already terrified. So the fact that a horse shows terror in his eyes, yeah, it probably did increase their fear because it's a grisly, it's a horror, the horror, it's a fear, it spreads, it's infectious. Fear is infectious. It's like the spirit of fear that sweeps across the men. But God did not give us a spirit of fear. He gave us a spirit of power and love and of a sound mind. But they're not focusing on that. They're focusing on the fear. And they have plenty of time to do it. Lie down, cried the adjutant, throwing himself on the flat ground. Just the imagery of victims. The imagery. I mean, don't get me wrong. If the bombs are going off and fragments are flying all over, lying down may be the thing to do, especially if you're just sitting there. So then Prince Andrew is hit by fragments, and he writes, "Can this be death?" So he starts getting contemplative. Can this be death? I cannot do. I do not wish to die. And the thing is, Napoleon once said, a coward dies 1,000 deaths every day. A brave man dies but once. And in a sense, Prince Andrew's already died 1,000 deaths, and now he's just facing the 1,000 number 1 deaths. If he would have perhaps taken Napoleon's approach and lived with courage, then perhaps he would be in a better situation, as I'm about to show in just a moment. So get into the steppe, Fyodor. I say, Fyodor, they show these what are called, Tolstoy calls them peasants, and these guys they're carrying Prince Andrew in the stretcher, and these guys are jolly. It says here they're joyfully carrying this guy, and I would argue that the reason they're joyful is they're taking action. They're doing something. They're productive. They're carrying Prince Andrew. So they're the only ones who are doing anything, and they're the only ones who are portrayed as joyfully. I don't know if Tolstoy noticed that, or maybe he did. Tolstoy writes, around the wounded stood crowds of stretcher bearers with dismal and attentive faces. in order to do this talk today, I had to create a brand new disorder. I call it the passive depressive disorder. These people are depressed because they're passive. That's what's going on here. It's not the indomitable mindset. It's the victim mindset. Passive depressive disorder. This is a huge key in terms of having the indomitable mindset. Is you don't want you cannot allow yourself to get passive depressive disorder. And then if Tolstoy writes, if only the reserves had come up just then, lads, there would be nothing left, I tell you surely. So in other words, if only the reserves had come up, we would have had victory. Exactly. But the problem is you have passive depressive disorder. You won't take action. How the heck do you expect the reserves to take action? If you won't even take action, they also have passive depressive disorder. So that's the problem here, is nobody's taking action. Everybody's hoping somebody else will do something. So Tolstoy writes, hearing the moans, Prince Andrew wanted to weep. He starts getting reflective of his childhood here and dying. You're facing death. That's probably a normal thing to do. I haven't done that, but it's probably a normal thing to do. Memories of childhood. And then he starts worrying about the suffering of his men. The only problem is he's so worried. Now, don't get me wrong. There's actually some light here, some beauty in what Prince Andrew's doing. He's learning that he's not just a cold warrior. He cares about his men. Compassion, love of our brothers. Tolstoy writes, love of our brothers, for those who love us and who hate us. Love our enemies. Yes, that love which God preached on earth. Okay, so he's talking about loving, love, which Christ came to preach, and which is certainly a beautiful, beautiful imagery. And it seems like he's Prince Andrew is having sort of a crisis, a midlife crisis or something, and he's facing. It's very complicated. How do you weigh all of these things? War versus love your enemies. It's very complicated, and it seems like it's left the prince paralyzed. Probably these are things he should have worked out long before battle. If you love your men, then don't probably. Well, what would King David do? King David in the Bible led his men through boldly to victory. What about the Battle of Lepanto, where the Christians were facing the Muslims were going to take over all of Europe, and there was one last stand, the Battle of Lepanto. What did they do? Did they start smelling flowers? No, they went to battle. Now all of Europe was praying the Rosary, which is why they won the battle. But it wouldn't have happened unless the Italians were willing to fight, and the Europeans were willing to fight. They had to fight, and you had to pray in the fight. You need faith and action, and so he's wrestling with a lot of philosophical issues here, and it's not really what you want to do in the midst of battle. These things can take years to sort out. And then we have finally. Tolstoy writes, Napoleon has a similar situation where this is a weakened Napoleon, where some say he's sick, others say that his own troops they had also had heavy losses because they did have the poor position, and so he's saying, look, the morale of the old guards some say the morale was so low that the soldiers he couldn't commit his rear guard, his old guard, because the morale was so low on his side also, and so they couldn't fight. It would have been. So that's why I argue that even though they're retreating, the Russians retreating at some point, there was maybe a good plan. At this point, they should have attacked, because if it's true that Napoleon was he was sick, if he was starting to waver, his powers were diminished perhaps slightly, and his own men were in low morale, this would have been the time to attack. And had the Russians attacked, they might have had an incredible victory. Thanks for watching. Fight on.